On a quiet afternoon in a bustling city park, a teenage boy sat alone on a weathered bench, sketching the world around him with a sharp eye and a steady hand. Malcolm Hayes wasn't looking for trouble. He was just lost in his art, capturing the laughter of children near the fountain and the gentle sway of trees in the breeze. But trouble has a way of finding those who least deserve it. When the shadow of a stern officer fell across his page, Malcolm had no idea that a routine afternoon would turn into a confrontation that would change lives and expose truths that couldn't stay hidden. The sunlight streamed through the oak trees in the park, casting dappled shadows on the winding paths. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, carrying with it the scent of freshly cut grass. The air was alive with laughter from children playing on the swings, joggers' rhythmic footfalls, and the chirping of sparrows perched along the hedgerow. Malcolm Hayes sat on a weathered wooden bench near the park's edge, a sketchbook balanced on his lap. His pencil moved swiftly, capturing the scene before him, a group of toddlers chasing each other near the fountain. His focus was absolute, his strokes precise, and his thoughts serene. Drawing was his escape, his way of finding calm amidst the noise of the world. The tranquility was shattered when he heard the sharp crunch of boots on gravel. He looked up to see a police officer approaching. The man wore dark sunglasses, his badge glinting in the sunlight, and his hand resting on the holster of his gun. Malcolm's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to remain calm. Encounters like these had been drilled into him by his father. Stay respectful, keep your hands visible, speak clearly and calmly. Hey you, the officer barked, stopping a few feet away. What are you doing here? Malcolm blinked, taken aback by the harsh tone. I'm just drawing, he replied, holding up his sketchbook as proof. The officer, whose name tag read Carson, squinted at the notebook. His face was set in a scowl. Drawing, huh? Looks more like you're casing the area. Vandalism, maybe? What? Malcolm frowned, the accusation catching him off guard. No, sir. I'm just sketching. You can see. Don't get smart with me, kid, Carson interrupted, his hand tightening on his belt. What's your name? Malcolm, he answered, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. Malcolm Hayes. Carson took a step closer, towering over him. And what are you doing hanging around here, Malcolm? Don't you have somewhere else to be? Malcolm glanced around, noticing the curious stares from a few nearby park-goers. Embarrassment mixed with unease. Sir, I'm just minding my own business. I'm not doing anything wrong. But Carson wasn't listening. His gaze was hard, scrutinizing Malcolm as though he were guilty of something he hadn't done. Stand up, Carson ordered. Malcolm hesitated, confusion and frustration bubbling to the surface. Why? I didn't. Now, Carson's voice boomed, silencing the chatter of the park. Malcolm slowly rose to his feet. His sketchbook slipped to the ground. As he bent to retrieve it, Carson's voice turned icy. Don't move. Malcolm froze, his hands hovering midair. I'm just picking up my... Enough. Carson's face was flushed with anger. He pulled out his pepper spray, the nozzle aimed directly at Malcolm's face. Panic surged through Malcolm. Wait, I'm not. A sharp burst of liquid fire hit his eyes. Pain erupted, and he staggered back, clutching his face. His vision blurred, tears streaming uncontrollably as his skin burned. He heard gasps and murmurs from onlookers, but couldn't see anything. You people never learn, do you? Carson muttered under his breath as he grabbed Malcolm by the arm and yanked him toward the patrol car parked nearby. Why are you doing this? Malcolm managed to choke out through the stinging pain. I didn't do anything wrong. Yeah, that's what they all say, Carson sneered, shoving him roughly toward the car. From the corner of the park, a man in a janitor's uniform stood frozen, his broom in one hand and a trash bag in the other. Henry, the park custodian, had seen everything. His jaw clenched as he watched Carson manhandle the boy. With quiet determination, Henry set down his tools and began to follow, his steps slow and deliberate. Someone needed to speak up for that kid. As the patrol car door slammed shut, locking Malcolm inside, the first seeds of justice were already being planted. Special Agent David Hayes sat in his car, scanning through a stack of case files. His mind, ever meticulous, was focused on the details of a critical operation involving an underground trafficking ring. The job often demanded more than any single person could give, but David had always prided himself on managing both his career and his responsibilities as a father. A soft buzz from his phone broke his concentration. It was a text from Malcolm, done at the park. Ready when you are. David smiled. His son was a sharp, thoughtful young man, qualities David admired more than he often expressed. He glanced at his watch. 15 minutes should do it, he thought, as he packed the files into his briefcase. He started the car and headed toward the park, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the city streets. As he pulled into the parking lot, something immediately felt off. A small crowd had gathered near the park's edge, their expressions a mix of concern and hesitation. David's trained eyes darted toward the source of the commotion, a police car idling near the curb, its red and blue lights flashing faintly. His heart skipped a beat when he recognized the figure inside the back seat. Malcolm. David's mind raced as he parked and got out, his movements calm but purposeful. His years in law enforcement had taught him the value of measured actions, even in moments of personal urgency. Approaching the scene, he spotted a man in a janitor's uniform standing a few feet away, his brow furrowed in worry. "Excuse me," David said, his voice steady but firm. "What happened here?" The janitor, Henry, looked up, relief washing over his face. "Are you related to the boy? I saw everything." That cop, he gestured towards Officer Carson, grabbed him for no reason. The kid was just sitting there drawing, and now he's in the back of that car. David's jaw tightened, but he nodded, keeping his composure. "Thank you. I'll handle this." Henry hesitated, then added, "I'll stick around if you need me to back you up. Someone has to." David offered a brief, appreciative nod before turning his attention to the officer. Carson was leaning against the patrol car, his posture casual, as if the scene behind him wasn't raising alarms. David approached, his presence commanding without being overtly confrontational. "Officer," David began, his tone firm but polite. "What's going on here?" Carson barely glanced at him. "Routine patrol. The kid was acting suspicious, so I brought him in for questioning." David's eyes narrowed. "Suspicious? How?" Carson smirked, crossing his arms. "Loitering, possibly vandalizing. When I approached, he got mouthy, so I had to de-escalate." David's jaw clenched, but he refused to let anger cloud his judgment. "De-escalate? By pepper spraying a teenager sitting on a park bench? That boy happens to be my son." The casual confidence drained from Carson's face, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "Your son." David stepped closer, his badge appearing in his hand like a quiet thunderclap. "Special Agent David Hayes, FBI," he said, his voice dropping to a chilling calm. "And I'm going to need a full account of what just transpired here." Carson's face paled as he stammered. I was just doing my job." David's eyes bore into him. "Your job, Officer Carson, does not include assaulting innocent teenagers. Release my son. Now." The growing crowd watched with bated breath as Carson fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the car door. Malcolm stumbled out, his face red and streaked with tears, his eyes swollen from the pepper spray. David immediately moved to his son, inspecting his injuries with a mixture of tenderness and barely restrained fury. "You okay, son?" he asked softly. Malcolm nodded weakly, his voice hoarse. "I'm fine, Dad." David straightened, his gaze snapping back to Carson. "Fine isn't the word I'd use. Your actions today were reckless, discriminatory, and completely unacceptable." Carson opened his mouth to respond, but David raised a hand, silencing him. "Don't say another word." David turned to Malcolm. "Let's get you to a doctor. This isn't over." As he guided Malcolm toward his car, Henry stepped forward, his voice quiet but resolute. "If you need a witness, I'm your guy." That officer crossed every line. David nodded again. "I'll be in touch." "Thank you." Carson watched them go, the weight of what had just transpired beginning to settle over him. He had no idea that the worst was yet to come. The drive to the hospital was tense, the silence in the car broken only by Malcolm's occasional sniffles. David's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white against the dark leather. The sight of his son, his bright, talented boy reduced to such a state, was almost more than he could bear. "Dad." Malcolm choked, his voice hoarse from the pepper spray. "I didn't do anything. I swear." David glanced at him briefly, his expression softening. "I know, son. You don't have to explain." "But he just—" Malcolm's voice broke, and he turned to stare out of the window, frustration and pain etched on his face. David exhaled slowly, forcing his anger down. "We'll handle this, Malcolm. You didn't deserve any of this, and that officer will answer for what he did." The hospital visit was straightforward but sobering. The doctor confirmed that the pepper spray had caused no permanent damage, but Malcolm would need time for the irritation to subside. The doctor handed David a report detailing the injuries, along with clear instructions for Malcolm's care. As they left the hospital, David's resolve hardened. He had faced threats and challenges in his career, but this felt personal because it was. And when things got personal, David Hayes ensured they were resolved swiftly and justly. Back at home, David sat in his study, a steaming cup of coffee untouched on the desk beside him. He'd spent the past 2 hours meticulously documenting every detail of the incident. The report from the hospital, Malcolm's torn and pepper-stained clothing, and even his own eyewitness testimony as an FBI agent. All of it was being prepared to hold Carson accountable. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a text from Henry, the park custodian. "I saw the whole thing. Got it all in my statement. Let me know when you need me." David replied with a simple thank you before turning his attention back to the task at hand. Carson had underestimated who he was dealing with, and David intended to ensure he learned the full extent of his mistake. The next morning, David walked into the police precinct, his stride confident and deliberate. He had already called ahead, ensuring that the precinct captain, a firm woman named Captain Laura Mitchell, would be available. Mitchell greeted him in her office with a mix of respect and curiosity. "Agent Hayes," she said, gesturing to a chair. "I understand you have something urgent to discuss." David handed over the file he had prepared, his movements precise and calculated. "This concerns one of your officers, Jack Carson." Mitchell's brows furrowed as she opened the file. Her expression darkened as she read through the detailed account of the incident. The hospital report, the witness statement, and the photos of Malcolm's injuries painted a damning picture. "This is serious," Mitchell said, looking up at David. "But I need to ask, are you seeking legal action, or is this strictly an internal matter?" David's gaze was steady. "Both. I expect a thorough investigation into Carson's conduct, and I'll be pursuing charges if necessary. My son deserves justice." Mitchell nodded, her tone firm. "You have my word, Agent Hayes. I don't tolerate misconduct in my department." Meanwhile, Carson sat at his desk, oblivious to the storm brewing against him. His usual smug confidence was intact as he recounted the previous day's events to a colleague, spinning the narrative in his favor. "Kid got mouthy," he said with a shrug. "Had to show him who's in charge." His colleague gave a weak chuckle, but the unease in his expression was clear. The precinct had seen its fair share of complaints against Carson, but few had ever led to meaningful consequences. This time, however, felt different. The door to the precinct swung open, and Captain Mitchell stepped in, her expression unreadable. "Carson," she called, her voice cutting through the low hum of chatter. "In my office." "Now." Carson stood, his smirk faltering. "What's this about?" "Now," Mitchell repeated, leaving no room for argument. As Carson followed her into the office, the weight of the situation began to sink in. His arrogance had carried him through countless questionable actions, but this time he was up against an opponent he couldn't intimidate, a father with both the resources and determination to see justice done. And the first cracks in Carson's facade were beginning to show. Officer Jack Carson sat stiffly in Captain Mitchell's office, his palms beginning to sweat despite his attempts to appear nonchalant. Across the desk, Mitchell's piercing gaze bore into him as she placed a thick file on the desk between them. The air was tense, the usual hum of the precinct distant and muted. "Officer Carson," Mitchell began, her tone ice cold. "Care to explain this?" Carson's eyes flicked to the file, recognizing the hospital report and witness statements. His throat tightened. "I was doing my job," he said, his voice defensive. "The kid was acting suspicious. I followed protocol." "Protocol?" Mitchell's voice rose slightly, her disbelief evident. "Your protocol involves pepper spraying an unarmed teenager for sitting on a bench and drawing in a sketchbook? That's your story." Carson shifted in his seat, his bravado cracking. He was uncooperative. "I had to maintain control of the situation." Mitchell leaned forward, her expression a mixture of fury and incredulity. "Control? You call spraying a minor in the face and dragging him to your car control? That boy wasn't a threat. He was your victim." Carson's attempt at a retort died in his throat as Mitchell slammed the file shut and stood. "You're suspended, effective immediately. Hand over your badge and weapon." The words hit Carson like a freight train. "Suspended?" he stammered. "You can't." "I can, and I have," Mitchell snapped, her tone leaving no room for argument. "This precinct won't protect you from your own misconduct. There will be a full investigation, and trust me, Carson, this doesn't look good for you." As the reality of his situation sank in, Carson felt the first tendrils of panic grip him. He opened his mouth to protest, but Mitchell cut him off with a glare. "Get out of my office." Carson stood slowly, his usual swagger replaced with a defeated slump. The murmurs of his colleagues followed him as he walked back to his desk to pack up his things. Across town, David Hayes sat at his kitchen table, the morning paper folded neatly beside a cup of coffee. Malcolm was upstairs resting, his swollen eyes gradually returning to normal. The sight of his son's pain lingered in David's mind, fueling his determination. His phone buzzed, and he picked it up to see a message from Captain Mitchell. "Carson has been suspended. Internal investigation underway. Let me know if you'd like to be updated further." David allowed himself a brief, satisfied nod. It was a small step, but a necessary one. He replied with a curt "thank you" before setting the phone down. "Dad." Malcolm's voice broke the quiet. David turned to see his son standing at the foot of the stairs, his expression weary but resolute. "Morning, son," David said, motioning for him to sit. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Malcolm replied, sliding into the chair across from his father. "Did anything happen with that cop?" David hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "He's been suspended. There's an investigation into what he did." Malcolm frowned. "Is that enough?" "He didn't just hurt me, Dad. He treated me like I wasn't even human." David's chest tightened at the words, but he kept his tone calm. "It's a start, Malcolm. But no, it's not enough. That's why I'm not stopping here." Malcolm looked down at the table, his hands fidgeting with a loose thread on his shirt. "I just don't want this to happen to someone else." David reached across the table, placing a steady hand on his son's. "And it won't. Not if I can help it." Meanwhile, at the precinct, the cracks in Carson's reputation began to deepen. The internal affairs officer assigned to the case was a meticulous investigator named Detective Morales, known for her direct approach. As she sifted through Carson's record, a troubling pattern emerged. There were multiple complaints of excessive force, particularly against young men of color. While most had been dismissed due to lack of evidence, the sheer number of incidents painted a damning picture. Morales leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. This wasn't just a single bad decision. It was a pattern of abuse. She picked up her phone and dialed Captain Mitchell. "Captain, we need to dig deeper into Carson's past. I have a feeling this case is just the tip of the iceberg." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Carson sat alone in his apartment. His suspension weighed heavily on him, but what truly gnawed at his mind was the looming investigation. He had always operated with a sense of invincibility, confident that the system would shield him from consequences. But this time was different. The Hayes family wasn't just another name on a complaint form. David Hayes was a man of influence, and Carson was beginning to realize that his actions had set a chain of events into motion that he could no longer control. And for the first time in his career, Jack Carson felt fear. Jack Carson's apartment was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. He sat on the edge of his couch, his mind racing. The suspension had been bad enough, but the whispers filtering through the precinct were worse. Rumors of an internal affairs deep dive into his record spread like wildfire. His invincibility, the shield he had relied on for so long, was cracking, and the realization clawed at him. His phone buzzed, snapping him from his thoughts. It was a message from his lawyer, a terse reminder: "Do not contact anyone involved. Stay quiet. Let me handle this." But Carson couldn't stay quiet, not with his entire career on the line. Throwing on a jacket, he grabbed his car keys and stormed out. If he was going down, he wasn't going without a fight. At the Hayes household, a different atmosphere prevailed. Malcolm sat in the living room, sketchbook balanced on his lap. He was quieter than usual, his pencil moving slower than it had before. Every so often, he would glance toward the kitchen where his father was on a call. David's voice was calm but firm, each word carrying the weight of determination. "Yes, I forwarded all the evidence to your office. No, I'm not interested in a settlement. This isn't about money. I want accountability." Malcolm sighed, setting his pencil down. The events of the past few days had left him feeling more drained than he'd expected. It wasn't just the physical pain, though the burning in his eyes had been unbearable. It was the humiliation, the sheer injustice of it all. "You okay?" a voice asked from the doorway. Malcolm looked up to see his father leaning against the frame, his expression softening. "I guess," Malcolm replied. "It just feels heavy, you know? Like no matter what happens, nothing will really change." David walked over and sat beside him. "It feels that way now," he said. "But change doesn't happen overnight. It's the small battles, the everyday fights, that eventually shift things. Malcolm nodded, but his doubt lingered. He wanted to believe his father, but the sting of Carson's actions had left a mark deeper than words could soothe. At the precinct, Detective Morales continued her investigation. The deeper she dug, the uglier the picture became. A pattern emerged, not just of excessive force, but of strategic cover-ups. Complaints were buried under mountains of bureaucratic red tape, with key witnesses mysteriously withdrawing their statements. It was clear Carson had relied on a network of complacency to keep his record clean. Morales smirked grimly. Not this time. She compiled the findings into a comprehensive report and forwarded it to Captain Mitchell. As she hit send, she leaned back in her chair, satisfaction settling over her. Carson wasn't just facing suspension anymore. He was facing potential criminal charges. Carson's night took a different turn. His drive through the quiet streets led him to a bar on the outskirts of town, a place he frequented when he needed to blow off steam. He downed a drink quickly, his mind replaying every decision that had brought him to this point. Somewhere between his second and third drink, his bravado returned. "This is all a damn witch hunt," he muttered to the bartender, who nodded politely, clearly uninterested. Carson's phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from the precinct. It was a formal summons. "You are required to appear for an internal affairs hearing at 10 a.m. tomorrow." His grip tightened on the phone. "They think they can bury me," he growled. "We'll see about that." The next morning, the Hayes family sat around the breakfast table. Malcolm was eating in silence when his father's phone buzzed. David glanced at the screen and stood abruptly. "What is it?" Malcolm asked. "It's from Captain Mitchell," David replied. "The internal investigation is complete. They've uncovered enough to escalate this." Malcolm's eyebrows shot up. "Escalate? How?" David's expression was grim. "Carson isn't just facing departmental consequences anymore. They're recommending criminal charges." Malcolm stared at his father, a flicker of hope breaking through the heaviness in his chest. "Does that mean he'll actually pay for what he did?" David nodded slowly. "It's a step in the right direction, son. But the fight's not over." At the precinct, Carson arrived for the hearing, his face a mask of forced confidence. But as he entered the room, he was met with stony faces and cold stares. Captain Mitchell sat at the head of the table, flanked by Detective Morales and a representative from the district attorney's office. "Officer Carson," Mitchell began, her tone devoid of emotion. "This hearing will address not only the events involving Malcolm Hayes, but also the broader pattern of misconduct uncovered during the investigation." Carson's lawyer tried to intervene. "Captain, with all due respect." Mitchell raised a hand, silencing him. "Save it for the formal proceedings. This is a courtesy hearing. Officer Carson's fate is already sealed." As the charges were read aloud, Carson's confidence finally crumbled. He sat in stunned silence, the weight of his actions and their consequences finally crashing down on him. For the first time in years, Jack Carson was truly powerless, and the justice he had long evaded was finally catching up. Jack Carson sat at the defendant's table in a packed courtroom, his face pale and drawn. The hearing had escalated quickly from internal disciplinary measures to criminal proceedings. As evidence of his pattern of misconduct grew overwhelming, the district attorney had charged him with assault, misconduct, and violations of civil rights. The prosecution had spared no effort in building a damning case. The courtroom was filled with murmurs as David Hayes entered with Malcolm at his side. Malcolm's swollen eyes had healed, but the emotional scars were still evident in his quiet demeanor. David, ever the rock of resilience, placed a hand on his son's shoulder and guided him to their seats. The prosecution called its first witness, Henry, the park custodian. "I saw everything," he said, his voice steady. "That boy was just sitting there, drawing in his notebook." Officer Carson approached him for no reason, started yelling, and then pepper sprayed him. It was unprovoked and completely unnecessary. Carson's defense attorney attempted to poke holes in Henry's testimony, but the custodian's unwavering account held firm. Combined with the medical report, David's own eyewitness testimony, and records of Carson's past abuses, the evidence painted a grim picture. By the end of the trial, Carson's fate was sealed. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with a verdict, guilty. As the judge handed down the sentence, prison time along with a permanent ban from serving in law enforcement, Carson's once arrogant facade crumbled. He slumped in his seat, the weight of his actions and their consequences finally crushing him. David watched silently, his expression unreadable. For him, The victory wasn't about vengeance. It was about justice. He glanced at Malcolm, who gave a small nod. They had fought the battle together, and now they could begin to heal. In the weeks following the trial, Malcolm found himself spending more time with his sketchbook than ever. But his drawings had taken on a new tone. No longer just landscapes and everyday scenes. He began illustrating stories of resilience and justice, pouring his emotions into his art. One afternoon, he showed his father a piece he'd been working on, a stark image of a young boy sitting on a park bench, surrounded by oppressive shadows, with a faint light breaking through the darkness. David studied the drawing, his chest tightening with emotion. "This is powerful," David said, his voice thick. "You've taken something painful and turned it into something meaningful." Malcolm nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "It helps," he admitted. "It feels like I'm taking back control." David ruffled his son's hair affectionately. "You're stronger than you know, Malcolm. And I'm proud of you." David didn't stop with Carson's trial. Recognizing the systemic issues that had allowed officers like Carson to thrive, he worked with community leaders and the precinct's Captain Mitchell to implement new training protocols and accountability measures. The precinct underwent a rigorous overhaul, ensuring that no officer could wield unchecked power again. Detective Morales, inspired by the case, spearheaded a task force to reopen other dismissed complaints, giving a voice to those who had been silenced. The ripple effect of Carson's trial reached far beyond one precinct, sparking conversations about justice and reform across the city. One crisp fall afternoon, David and Malcolm returned to the park where it all began. The memories of that day were still fresh, but Malcolm approached the bench with a newfound sense of peace. He sat down, sketchbook in hand, and began to draw. Nearby, a little girl chased a butterfly, her laughter ringing out across the park. David watched her for a moment, then turned his gaze back to his son, who was completely absorbed in his work. As the sunlight filtered through the trees, David felt a deep sense of pride and hope. They had faced injustice head-on and emerged stronger. The battle wasn't over. There was still work to be done, but for now, they could breathe. Malcolm looked up from his sketchbook and smiled at his father. "Thanks, Dad," he said simply. David smiled back, his heart full. "Anytime, son." The shadows of the past began to fade as the Hayes family embraced the light of a brighter future, one sketch, one step, and one victory at a time.